Okay, so I think that this is kind of worth talking about for a couple minutes here. But before we get started, I just want to apologize for my lack of uploads as of late. I've been really wanting to talk about Spiral, The Walking Dead, American Horror Story, and all the other things that I talk about constantly on this channel. However, with a full-time job and looking for other jobs while trying to keep up my social life and just everything else, this channel has gone a little bit on the back burner. Luckily, this hiatus did allow me to complete a little bit more of a visual element for the channel, which I've been working on for the last couple of weeks. And I really hope you guys enjoy that. But anyway, let's get back to the point of this video. One of the biggest complaints I've talked about recently when it comes to Spiral from the Book of Saul is how I have yet to see anything that would prove to me that Chris Rock is in fact a die-hard Saul fan. And look, I know that we've heard time and time again from the producers and the studio that Chris Rock has been a fan since the series first started back in 2004, but I've always kind of had my doubts about that. And you know what? Before anyone goes down to the comment section and starts talking about how amazing Get Out was, or A Quiet Place, and how those films and many others as of late have totally reinvented your perspective on comedians dipping their toes into the horror genre, I just want to stop you right here. Look, I'm not trying to say in this video that comedians simply can't do horror. Honestly, one of the things I've always thought of is if you understand comedy as a form of entertainment, you can probably do any other genre, especially horror. Those things are really hard to get down, and having timing right is important to both. Also, I do want to make it clear that I'm not making this video to talk solely about Chris Rock taking over the Saw franchise. If anything, the series kind of needed someone to just step in and try something different. And at the end of the day, I really do hope that this movie is good, and I'm pretty excited to see where they're going to take it as the franchise moves onward. I'm also a bit hopeful that by staying true to the narrative that was built over the last 8 films, that they will eventually make their way to some big crossover event, taking characters from this new movie and characters from the previous 8 and putting them in a movie together. Or maybe a little bit more exciting for people like me, is it possible that we're going to see an expansion of the Saw franchise into other medium, like television, comic books, or maybe even more video games? So really, with that being said, I am truly making this video to try and make sense of this subtle narrative that's been slowly force-fed to us over the last couple of months, whether you really know it or not. And that is Chris Rock a true fan of the Saw franchise? Now, I think it's important to mention that Chris Rock does not have to be a mega fan in order to become the creative force behind the series. But a sculpted narrative from various media outlets trying to build the narrative that he is in fact a big fan of the long-running franchise does seemingly go a long way to assure longtime fans that their favorite series is in good hands. I mean, if you're going to be promoting a new take on an old franchise with From the Mind of blank, you do need to kind of ensure people that what you're doing is the best for the product. And with that being said, one of the most recent talking points about the upcoming Saw film is when the original series creator Leigh Whannell spoke about his knowledge of Chris Rock's fandom. Apparently, the story goes that a while back the two met at a party, and after initially ignoring Whannell's attempts to start a conversation, once Chris Rock learned that Leigh Whannell was the creator of the Saw franchise, he quickly changed his tone. One of the things Whannell said in the story is that Chris Rock told him at that party is that one day he aspired to making a Saw film of his own. Now, there's a few things I want to say about this story before hopefully bringing this discussion back around to where I started at the beginning. First off, this doesn't really seem like a vote of confidence in the product, more than simply an affirmation of the narrative that is being told to us over the last several months. Furthermore, I would argue on a side of caution. It is hard to take people at their word when they stand to benefit from the hype or excitement that those words may cause. And in this case, Leigh Whannell is definitely one of those people. As one of the core creators of the franchise, I'm sure he profits, at least in some way, from the continuation of the series. Plus, it wouldn't be strange to see a well-respected creator come out of the woodwork to praise the work of other people continuing the thing that he or she created. Looking at you, James Cameron. Especially if that creator has something else to promote at the time when he or she is asked. Leigh Whannell is obviously still promoting The Invisible Man, which dropped last weekend. But even to all of those points, I can't recall any time where Leigh Whannell has spoken about the Saw franchise since he left the series after the third film. Usually, if he talks about it at all, it's during a press tour for another project of his that is currently being released, as he tiptoes around questions about whether he'd like to come back to the series, and if he did, what would he do differently. And in that, it does remind me a lot of his press tours during the release of Insidious: The Last Key, where he talked about how the Saw franchise is like his child, which has grown up and is now capable of existing outside of his influence. One of the key differences from then to now is that by the time The Last Key had dropped, Leigh Whannell had all the chance in the world to see Jigsaw as a film, but his comments kind of lended to the fact that he hadn't seen it, at least at that point. That might be true, that might not be true, it's just what I got from that interview. As a whole, taking all of this into account, one of the things I desperately want to get to you is that it seems like Leigh Whannell doesn't really care about the future of the Saw franchise as of right now, that he has no real involvement in it. But even with all of that said, this story that he's telling about Chris Rock, at least to me, seems like a genuine story that helps to establish that Chris Rock is indeed a fan of the franchise. Because it's pretty clear that right now Leigh Whannell has not seen Spiral, and that he only makes these comments to kind of tell everyone that even though he was a big fan of Chris Rock and felt like Chris Rock had no reason of knowing him, because of this world that he created, they found a little bit of common ground, and it goes a long way, at least for me, to see that Chris Rock is indeed a fan of the franchise, someone who really wanted to play in a sandbox that Leigh Whannell and James Wan created. However, even if that is the case, I still have my doubts about whether or not Chris Rock running a Saw sequel is in fact a good idea. As I mentioned before, I think that comedians can do a great job with horror if they understand the art of comedy, but it's one thing to make an original horror film as a comedic talent, and it's another thing entirely to take over a long-running horror franchise. Yes, Get Out, Us, A Quiet Place, they're great films with prominent comedians, but I'd argue that their greatness comes from their unique and original concepts. Jordan Peele showed us that he understood the dynamic of racial tension surrounding the United States through his comedy for years on television before shifting that perspective onto the horrors of a liberal racism and class warfare. While John Krasinski became a household name by expressing humor through facial expressions in The Office before creeping through a world in which making any noise would get you killed. The point I'm trying to make here is that while those films are good in their own right, they don't really come out of nowhere. You can see the inklings of an idea from a creator's work and where they drew inspiration. By taking those ideas, they're able to craft a narrative in an entirely new world that suits the message that they're trying to convey. But when you meddle around in a pre-existing world like Saw, you have less room to wiggle, and your message might not really fit into that world. I think the best example to this that I could give is David Gordon Green's Halloween 2018, a film that is by no means a terrible sequel in a long-running horror franchise, but it is one of the laziest. I will admit that depicting Michael as an elderly man desperate to try to relive his 20s by upping the scale and recreating One Night He Came Home in the 1970s was a relatively good idea, yet literally everything else in that film was taken from one of the other films in the franchise, most of which did stuff better than Halloween 2018. Halloween 4 brought Michael back in a big way before 2018. H2O brought back Jamie Lee Curtis before 2018. Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, for all of its flaws, did PTSD Laurie in a more interesting way than 2018, and by that extension, so did H2O. And finally, the idea that Michael is just kind of some guy and we shouldn't care about him as much as we do, that was also a bit of a driving force in H2O. The point I'm trying to make here is that While I'm sure David Gordon Green and Danny McBride are big fans of the Halloween films, I think that their fandom might have blinded them from doing something completely original with the franchise they loved. At the end of the day, it wasn't the involvement of those two that convinced people to see Halloween 2018. It wasn't even original ideas. If anything, it was the promise that all the original players were coming back in a major capacity for one last ride. And that film is more like Star Wars The Force Awakens style soft reboot than any real recreation of the series. And if we're truly honest about ourselves, we don't really have any of those selling points when it comes to Spiral from the Book of Saw. Leigh Whannell isn't coming back in a major way, neither is James Wan. We've already been told that Tobin Bell isn't going to be a part of this film in any real major way. All we're really getting is Chris Rock riding on this narrative of comedians are awesome at scary movies now, so let's just give them a chance. I don't know if any of that's a good thing. I'm not even sure if anyone is thinking about this in the same way that I am. All I know is that Spiral looks new. I know that it looks different from all the other Saw films that came before it, and at the end of the day, one of the biggest things detractors of the series have said for years now is that the franchise needs to get out of its own rut. So if the answer to those questions and those concerns is just giving the keys to Chris Rock, who has shown himself to be a Saw fan and who has for years wanted to make a movie in this sandbox, then maybe that is the best direction forward. And you know what? Everything I've seen and heard from Spiral does make me believe that yes, he's a fan and he's been wanting to do this. And it would appear that his vision is exactly what Lionsgate and Twisted Pictures needed to have the confidence to prove critics wrong about this series. By giving it a new release date, pushing the original story from a known creative talent, all while staying true to the longtime fans by having the decency not to purge what came before it and keep it inside the world of the first 8 films. Honestly, as concerned as I might be, it is still relatively exciting, and it's definitely a great time to be a Saw fan. But that's just my take.